By the end of day 6 in the creation week, God looks over his creation and says that it is very good. Humanity is given pride of place as the final step and as a sort of climax to God's creation. And they're given the job of ruling over and bringing order and caring for God's creation. But things didn't stay very good. In Genesis 3, the man and the woman that were placed in the Garden of Eden take from the tree that God told them not to eat from, essentially grasping for the knowledge and the wisdom that God wanted to cultivate in them himself in his own time and in his own way. A rift was created between God and humanity, and they were banished from his presence. A rift was also created between the humans, between the man and the woman, and when confronted by God for what they had done, the first thing they do is throw each other under the bus. The first thing they do is to defend themselves, and it breaks their own relationships. And although God hadn't given up on his plans to extend his blessing over all creation, expanding the borders of the order and abundance of the Garden of Eden to encompass the whole world, we have to admit that for most of the Bible story, all of humanity, even God's chosen people, seem to spend a lot of time doing exactly the opposite. We see then that for all three views of being made in God's image, damage has been done. The Bible has a word for this: sin. Sin is a failure to reflect God's image as we ought. In other words, sin, both theologically and philosophically, is the failure to be truly human. That's how we're going to divide it up. We're going to look at theologically that we become what we worship, and we'll see philosophically that we become what we want. So let's look first. Theologically, we become what we worship. Psalm 115 gives us a comparison between Yahweh and the gods of the other nations. Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name be the glory, because of your love and faithfulness. Why do the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him. But their idols are silver and gold, made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel, feet but cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats. The gods of the other nations, it seems, are no gods at all. They're just idols. Silver and gold, made by human hands, inanimate objects, completely unable to do anything. We find some of the pictures in Isaiah where you have somebody who cuts down a tree, they cut it in half, and they use half of it to make themselves a god, and the other half to cook their meat and to keep themselves warm. And the point of this is obviously how ridiculous this is, and how the Israelites mustn't do the same thing. Now, even at this point, this actually would have been quite a thing to say. The nation of Israel was actually quite unusual for not having any sort of representation of their God. In the Ten Commandments, in Exodus and Deuteronomy, they were, of course, explicitly told not to make any image or any sort of idol. But as one writer explains, in the world of the ancient Near East, where gods of the nations were depicted with human and or animal-like images, a God who had no physical image was difficult to comprehend or embrace. But the real blow comes in Psalm 115, verse 8. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. Greg Beale puts it this way: if we worship idols, we will become like the idols, and that likeness will ruin us. Although it's a bit more subtle, we can see the same thing going on in Israel's prime example of idolatry, the golden calf in Exodus 32. The Israelites get sick of waiting for Moses, who's on top of the mountain, getting the law from God, and so they decide to make a representation of God for themselves. But having done so, look at the way that they're portrayed. In verse 9, they're called stiff-necked. In verse 25, they're left to run wild, and apparently needing to be brought back in again in verse 26. and so that Moses could lead them where God wanted them to go, verse 34. He's talking to the Israelites like they're animals. Again, quoting Greg Beale, sinful Israel is mocked by being depicted metaphorically as rebellious cows running wild and needing to be regathered because it had become as spiritually lifeless as the calf that it was worshipping. But it goes both ways. If idol worship has become as blind and deaf as the logs they call gods, and that they're bowed down to, the reverse is true of those who worship Yahweh. In Psalm 103, verse 6, we read, "The Lord, Yahweh, works righteousness and justice for all the oppressed." But that's just how those who worship him are described in Psalm 106, verse 3. "Blessed are those who act justly, who always do what is right." In fact, imitating God is what God expected of his people. The Israelites are called to care for the poor, not to take bribes, to care for the vulnerable and for the foreigner, and to treat their slaves well, because that's how God is. And that's how God has treated them. At a more fundamental level, we can spell it out in terms of how we reflect God's image in our vocation. Instead of reflecting God's image by ruling over creation, we set up man-made idols and allow ourselves to be ruled by creation. This actually explains the oddity that we saw earlier. The Israelites were very unusual for not having any sort of representation of their gods, but that is exactly the point. They didn't need images of their God because they were supposed to be images of their God. We see the same thing in Romans 1. In Romans 1-3, Paul mounts a lengthy case to show that all are under sin, Jew and Gentile alike. And in chapter 1, verses 21-25, we're shown the root of the problem, that they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images of creatures. Echoing Psalm 106, verse 20, they exchanged their glorious God for an image of a bull, which is itself a reflection on the golden calf incident that we looked at earlier. Echoes can also be heard of Genesis 1-3 in the way that the animals are listed, and the perversion of knowledge that we see there is maybe reminiscent of a particular tree in the middle of the garden. One scholar explains this way: man did not only exchange the worship of the true God for that of idols, he also exchanged intimate fellowship with God for an experience which was shadowy and remote. And he exchanged too his own reflection of the glory of God for the image of corruption. Paul doesn't say that man ever lost the image of God, though he regarded it as being almost effaced. The things which man did lose were the glory of God and the dominion over nature which were associated with that image, and he lost them when he forgot that he himself was the image of God and sought to find that image elsewhere. This is also what Paul has in mind when he says in Romans 3:23 that we have all sinned and fall short of God's glory. Sin is a failure to reflect God's image. Sin is a failure to be truly human. That's what we see theologically. That's what we see from Scripture anyway. But we also see this from philosophy. And we also see that we become what we want. Sin is to fail to be truly human. But before we can talk about that, we should first revisit what it means to succeed in being truly human. We'll mainly be building on what we saw in lesson 1, where we looked at the substantive view of what it means to be made in God's image. In our first lesson, we saw how everything in the world around us is composed of matter and form. And form, we said, is what makes a thing to be the sort of thing that it is. And we saw that form is functionally characterized. The form is defined by what the form does. A thing's form isn't determined simply by what it looks like, but by what we would expect that thing to do. A good instance of that thing is one that does those things well. A house that provides shelter and protection is a good house. A house with a leaky roof is not. A squirrel that climbs trees is a good squirrel. A squirrel that keeps up with the Kardashians is not. The same, of course, is true of us too, of humans. We saw in lesson 1 that the human form is a rational soul. So while we might share some of the same functions and inclinations as other animals, what sets us apart is that those are mediated through the rational intellect, which is capable of forming judgments about what counts as good. Not only does our nature incline us to some or other good, by virtue of the fact that we're rational beings, we decide for ourselves what that good is. We only ever do something insofar as we think that it is good, at least in some way. Now, we can talk about this on 2 levels. We could talk about the good of individual actions, or we could talk about the overarching good of all of our actions, what Aquinas talks about as the ultimate end. When we talk about the good of individual actions, we can explain them in terms of some further good, though. I might decide to go for a run. Why? So that I can get fit. Why would I want to get fit? So that I could be healthy, and so on. We could carry on going. Or I might decide to read a book. Why? Because I want to learn something. Why would I want to learn something? To be a more rounded individual. Again, we can go back and back. We can carry on going for some further explanation. But in the end, as one writer puts it, every act terminates in something done simply because it is good and for no further end. But this ultimate good, as we can call it, is simply the good that corresponds to the ultimate human activity, of which every other activity is but an ingredient, the living of the human life in all its fullness. So we only ever do something insofar as we think that it is good, and we do it because we think it'll lead to some ultimate good, whatever we take that to be. But what we perceive to be good might not be what's actually good, which is what opens up the possibility for sin. As one scholar explains, we sin when reason has presented a false good as if it were a true good. He goes on, everyone naturally desires his ultimate good. When he is morally well ordered, a person identifies his overall good with the divine good, which means that the choice between the divine good and some creaturely substitute is the fundamental choice between good and evil. Sin, then, is when the subjective good that we order ourselves to isn't in line with the objective good set by God. Or put differently, sin is an inordinate desire for a subordinate good. We can talk about this on 2 levels, which Aquinas calls mortal sin and venial sin, which are actually still categories that are used by the Roman Catholic Church. The basic difference is an intuitive one, and one I think we can all get on board with. Mortal sin is a rejection of God as our ultimate end. Venial sin is when we're still oriented towards God, when we still have God as our ultimate end. We might say that we're still in relationship with God, but we do things that are inconsistent with that ultimate end. In either case, sin is an inordinate desire for a subordinate good. It's a failure to act in accordance with right reason, which, since we're rational beings by nature, is a failure to act in accordance with our nature. And it's a failure to orient ourselves towards God, which puts a rift in our relationship, either in small ways that don't mean the end of our relationship with Him, but that are nevertheless offensive to Him, or in ultimate ways, where we choose to reject Him completely. God didn't leave us that way. In His Son, God opened the way for redemption and restoration. He promises new life and a renewed relationship with Him. Through Jesus, we have hope that we can be truly human once more and to reflect God's image in all of its fullness. But the details of that are for another time. For now, what I hope is clear is that sin both theologically and philosophically, is the failure to be truly human.